guys, it's Julie Spencer, author of the Buxton Peak series, and we are working our way through Buxton Peak Book 3, The End of the Beginning, and we are just starting into Chapter 9, which is called Goodbye and Hello. We need to talk. Jeremy hesitated. I'm glad you're all here, and that you haven't already heard it from someone else. What is this elusive thing that we have supposedly not heard? Ian teased him, looking up from the guitar he was holding. Jeremy's pained expression immediately alerted Ian that something was very wrong. He stood up and walked over to his manager. What is it, mate? There's been an accident. Jeremy looked over at Kai and then Andy. He glanced briefly at Nathaniel and looked back at Ian. I don't even know how to say this. Come here, mate. Ian guided Jeremy over to a chair in a rare display of role reversal. It's all right. It's going to be all right. No, Ian. Jeremy looked up at him. It's not. Gary was in a very bad car accident last night. He wrapped his car around a tree going about 110 miles an hour. What hospital is he in? Ian jumped up from his chair and reached for his jacket as if he was ready to go to the airport and fly to London immediately. Ian. Jeremy reached up and grabbed his arm. There wasn't much left of him at the scene. He's gone, Ian. No. Ian whispered. He shook his head as his voice grew progressively louder. That's not possible. He was just here 2 weeks ago for the awards show. He was very stoned, as he always is. What was he doing behind the wheel of a car? Who gave him permission to drive a vehicle? He should never drive. He's never sober enough to drive. Where was his driver? Who was supposed to be taking care of him? Ian crumbled to the floor on his knees, hands gripping his hair as if pulling it would somehow lessen the pain in his heart. Kai sat down hard on a chair and stared off into the corner. Andy dropped to his knees and sobbed. Nathaniel just sat at his drums and bowed his head, praying silently. Jeremy sat next to Ian and rubbed his shoulder, trying to comfort his young friend. This was a moment in life that none of them would ever forget. Ian walked quietly forward to where Gary's mother sat alone in the front of the little chapel. Most of the mourners wouldn't be arriving for another few hours, but Ian wanted a few minutes by themselves. He came and sat at Helen's feet and wrapped his arms around her. It was the first time in several days that he gave himself permission to completely let go and allow the grief to crush him. He felt safe in her arms. This was a woman who had packed lunches for the guys when they wanted to hike up into the hills and stocked her refrigerator with enough junk food to keep teenage boys' hunger at bay. She let the guys take over her basement with drum sets and guitars and microphones and enormous speakers and amplifiers. She put up with them back when they sounded terrible, and she always encouraged them. It was never a question of if her boys would become rock stars. It was always when. She had complete faith in them. Now she was without all her boys. Ian, Kai, and Andy were in America with a new drummer, and her Gary was about to be laid to rest forever. I never thought to hide his car keys, Helen whispered. Her fingers brushed through Ian's hair as he laid his head on her lap. His sobs had lessened to a rhythmic sniffle every few seconds. He felt as if he may break down at any moment, so he held very still and let his surrogate mother hold him as if she were holding Gary. Ian wished she were. He came and went so frequently, she said. He'd come home and sleep for a few days, sober up a little, and disappear again. I thought rehab would help. He needed to go back in. I knew that. I tried to talk to him, but he got mad, and he would get mad at me and leave again. Eventually, I stopped trying. I was just so thankful that he was home and safe for those few days that I didn't bother him while he was home. I should have forced him to go back. He was an adult. Ian sat up so he could face her. You can't force an adult into rehab. All you can do is try. You can't blame yourself for not trying hard enough. All those times he came and went, I always knew there was a possibility that one day he wouldn't come back. She put one hand on each side of Ian's face as if he was a little boy. That one day has come, hasn't it? Yeah, Ian whispered. It has. Helen lowered herself off the floor lowered herself off the chair so that she was sitting on the floor next to Ian and they held each other and cried. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding of love and grief for Gary. The basement door was closed, and Ian just stared at it. Everyone else was in the living room, eating the obligatory after-funeral luncheon, but he had quietly snuck away. He knew what was on the other side of that door, and he knew what was at the bottom of those stairs. Did he really want to take that journey? He knew exactly what would happen if he did. He lingered in the kitchen for several minutes before walking carefully forward. The creak of the door was barely audible, but he turned his head to see if anyone had heard and would come around the corner to scold him for invading his friend's private space. No one came to check, and he quietly tucked himself into the dark stairwell and pulled the door shut behind him. He didn't even bother turning on the light until he reached the bottom of the stairs, where he knew he'd find the switch that turned on the colored, sparkling disco ball, which hung above the ceiling. Flicking on that switch was like stepping back in time to when they were teenagers, not so long ago, before they were more than potential, before his mission service, before they were famous, before marriage and children and breakups and drug abuse and crashed cars, back when life was defined by simple, spinning, colorful lights. The lights reflect the shine on the cymbals and the silver rim of the snares. A few guitars and bass guitars hung on stands, forgotten and out of tune. A few microphones were even plugged into speakers. Nothing was covered in dust. Gary must have been here recently, or his mom regularly kept it all cleaned as if ready for her boys to return. They never would. As if in a dream, Ian stepped forward and gingerly sat at the drum set. A set of sticks waited at the ready. Did he dare? How loud would it be from upstairs? He couldn't hear them talking and eating and walking around. Would they be able to hear him? He picked up the sticks and just held them, caressing the wood gently. He closed his eyes and visualized Gary sitting there. What would his expression show? Peace? Resignation? Preparedness? Readiness? Eager to get started? Without realizing he was even doing it, Ian spun the stick in his right hand and began to play as if he played every day. He didn't think about the noise or who might hear him or what they might think. He just played with heart and soul and life. His breathing was even and steady, his eyes half closed, in a zone that usually only existed on stage or in a recording studio. This was Gary's original stage and his original recording studio. This was his original rehearsal room. This was home. Ian didn't hear them come down the stairs, and he didn't know they were in the room until suddenly there they were, strapping guitars around their shoulders and reaching for picks and turning knobs on amplifiers and speakers. He never stopped playing as Kai and Andy tuned their instruments, worked a few scales, and suddenly they were all playing together in a rhythm that was uniquely theirs. This was Buxton Peak. Not Buxton Peak with a new drummer, or a missing anything. This was Buxton Peak, playing as if Gary was right there with them. The hurt and anger was forgotten. The fighting and drugs and betrayal were gone. The brotherhood was here. Not that it was back. It was just here. They played for a very long time. It could have been hours. They jammed to several classic Buxton Peak songs. Cavendish Fire, Stone Ridge, Manchester Heights. They never slowed the rhythm down enough to play Passing Through Eternity, almost as if on purpose. They fell back into their original inspirations. You Give Love a Bad Name by Bon Jovi, Angel by Aerosmith, Paradise City and Sweet Child of Mine by Guns N' Roses. They avoided the Guns N' Roses song that launched Buxton Peak, Welcome to the Jungle. The drum solo would have thrown all of them over the edge. They needed closure, not tears. They needed to go back to their roots, but not quite that far. Then they just stopped and looked at one another and collectively took a deep breath before their usual group hug. When their arms came around each other's necks and their heads came together in the center, it felt whole. It felt right. They could do this. They could go forward now. They felt closure. Ian's stomach growled, and he chuckled. "How long's it been since you've eaten, pal?" Kai whispered. It was a rhetorical question. They'd been together for the better part of the past 4 days, and Ian had yet to eat anything. Ian had pushed food away any time someone tried to hand it to him, since the day they'd heard the news. "Let's go upstairs." Ian's legs felt heavy and weak as he trudged up the stairs. He went straight for the refrigerator and started digging. The house was quiet, and he wasn't even sure if there was anyone else here. The guys had barely started pulling out leftovers when Helen and Megan came quietly into the kitchen. Ian took a step towards Megan and pulled his wife into his arms. He didn't cry or speak or communicate anything other than the peace of having her with him. He just held her, knowing he'd neglected to let her in since the time he'd learned of Gary's death. He'd talk to her later. For now, he just wanted to hold her. His stomach growled again. Okay. Ian relented, chuckling. He looked down into Megan's eyes and smiled playfully. "Give me some food, woman." "It's about time." Megan looked over at Kai and winked at him, obviously thankful that whatever they'd done in the basement had brought back her husband. "Where are the others?" Andy inquired. "Vanessa and Rhonda took that adorable baby back to the hotel so he could sleep," Helen told them. We didn't want to interrupt the concert, but they needed some rest. "Congratulations, by the way." She was still looking directly at Andy, but he shook his head quizzically. "About what, Mrs. Owens?" "Please, Andy." She looked hurt. "After all these years, you know to call me Mum." "Sorry, Mum." Andy grabbed a roll off the counter and took a large bite without even putting butter on it. "Congratulations about your baby," Helen told Andy. "Well, that's not my baby," Andy explained with a full mouth. "That's Kai's baby." No, she shook her head. "Vanessa's your girlfriend, isn't she?" All conversation in the room stopped, and Andy stopped chewing and just stared at Helen. "Vanessa's not pregnant," Andy gulped. "Of course she is," Helen guffawed. "Can't you tell?" Andy shook his head and looked over at the other guys in shock. They all stared back at him with confusion. "Megan?" Andy questioned. "Did you know?" "I don't think she knows," Megan whispered. "If she did, we wouldn't have heard the end of it for the past few days or weeks. She's wanted a baby so bad I'm surprised she hasn't begged you for one by now. She must not know." They all turned to Helen. "How is it that you know?" Andy asked. Helen just laughed at them. "It's so obvious. Can't you see the glow on her face?" Helen just shook her head and started helping make sandwiches for her hungry musicians, chuckling as she went. Conversation continued to cease, but eating resumed, as they all stared ahead or looked at one another. Andy sat, chewing slowly and looking a little shocked. Kai broke the silence. "Mate," Kai grinned at him, "being a dad is the best." "I'll expect lots of brotherly advice on that." Andy looked terrified. Megan cuddled next to Ian and put her arms around his waist. He looked down at her. She looked up at him, and they sighed together. "Someday," Ian whispered. "When God's ready," Megan said. "Vanessa?" Andy hesitated in the doorway of their hotel suite. "Are you doing okay?" "I'm sleeping," she whispered. "What do you need?" She sat up halfway, trying to see him in the dark. "Are you feeling okay?" "Why wouldn't I be?" She was a bit more awake and sounded confused. He came over beside her and knelt down next to the bed. He pulled her closer to him very carefully, as if she were delicate and fragile. "Andy, are you all right? What's going on?" Andy didn't answer her, but he pulled the covers back slightly and put his hand gently on her non-existent belly. "Is it true?" He looked up at her lovingly. "Are you gonna have my baby?" "What?" Vanessa sat up all the way and looked at him in shock. "I'm not pregnant. Do I look fat to you?" "Oh my gosh, do I?" She pushed him away and got up from the bed. She turned on the light switch and looked into the full-length mirror near the bathroom. She turned every which way to see if she looked like she had gained any weight. "No, you don't look fat. You look beautiful. It's just that, well, Gary's mom thinks you're pregnant." "Why would she think that?" Vanessa seemed confused. "I don't know," he shrugged. "She said she could tell. She said it was really obvious. Megan said you might not even know you were pregnant because otherwise you'd be talking about it nonstop. Is that true? Do you want a baby? We can have a baby if you want one. You should have said something. I don't think I'd mind being a dad. I mean, Kai and Nathaniel seem to like being dads. I might. I'd love a baby, Vanessa smiled. But I don't think I'm pregnant. How would you know? Andy asked naively. Don't you have to take a test or something? Well, yeah, if I thought I was pregnant, I'd take a test. Maybe you should. Maybe you're right. She shrugged and turned back to the mirror, scanning for any outward signs. She looked completely normal, but still Andy stepped closer to her, smiled, and put his hand on her belly again. Let's not get our hopes up until we know one way or another. But they grinned at each other, suspecting they would soon be celebrating. That is the end of chapter 9. I'm sorry it was an emotional one. Chapter 10 is called When God's Ready. And we'll get to that another time.